Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm here with John and David and Sersa Victory. Thanks for joining us, Sersa.
Thanks for inviting me. I was really excited about this.
Yeah, we've been a fan of yours for a long time. Me and David, we actually met playing the D&D Open, and so we've always been like into competitive, really hard adventures that are like, you know, get by just barely, maybe live, probably don't live, and that really drew us to a lot of your early adventures in the fourth edition days. What was your start actually? Was those the first adventures you published, or when did you start publishing work?
So I think my first published RPG material was 2008 through what was then called Kobold Quarterly, and I wrote a few things for their blog, a few articles for their magazine, and I think it wasn't until about 2009, 2010 when I moved for grad school I needed something to do, and so I decided to start a blog because that's everybody at that time had a blog. That's how you made your name. And so I started a blog to explore how fourth edition might be made more amenable to the what's now called the OSR style.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and from there, I published a few free modules. The first of which was Revenge of the Iron Lich, which kind of took off. I co-authored that with a friend, Jerry Leneve. And then I went on to publish two more in that trilogy, Crucible of the Gods and Thane of the Heresiarch. And that was over 10 years ago. Um, let's see, try to fast forward. From there, kind of took a break, wandered around, got into 13th Age a little bit, continued to write more for Kobold Press, published more of my own stuff. I want to say probably 2017, I wrote two more adventures for Kobold Press. The first of which was called Tomb of Mercy, and the second, which is right up there next to, I just noticed that next to David, Necropolis of the Mailed Fist. And both of those, as far as I can tell, like as a Kobold Press writer, I don't see like the sales figures or the numbers. That's all, Wolfgang and his team. But my understanding is that it went really well. They did like a reprinting of it, and I got a lot of good feedback on that. From there, I sort of moved into doing some instructional stuff. So I'm very active with a site called Storytelling Collective. That is a site that started off as something called RPG Writer Workshop, where Ashley Warren, who you might know from Rime of the Frost Maiden, she also was the lead on the Uncaged series of 5e supplements. That's her baby, and she brought me on to do a number of dungeon design courses. Currently, there's a few up there. There's Moments, there's Traps, there's Treasure. I contribute to the Write Your First Adventure path that they have, and I've also got a few things up there related to choose your own adventure books, which is something that I'm also a fan of and write a couple of. Let's see, I'm trying to abbreviate like 13, 15 years of history here. But I guess to the thread that connects all of it is an interest in the traditional dungeon crawl. So I'm very much like trying to capture the feeling of an Indiana Jones movie or something along those lines. My introduction to fantasy was not through, like I was a late comer to things like Lord of the Rings and fantasy fiction. I actually got my start in fantasy through the video game Hexen, which I don't know if those of you remember that. And actually, all of my fourth edition modules were basically like very thinly veiled. I mean, even my logo is actually the logo of the villain from Heretic, which was the previous game in the series. Yeah, that's the trident of the serpent rider Desperal, who came from another chaos planet to subjugate. So for me, it was very much this background in like more challenge oriented and more like dodging traps and solving puzzles and finding treasure. I was very much a latecomer to things like role play, and I also have a war game background primarily. Like I was also kind of a latecomer to playing D&D. Like I played it a little bit in middle school, but it wasn't until college that I got to play it consistently. Mm-hmm. So before then, I was mostly like a Warhammer player, BattleTech, that sort of thing. And for me, like that's in my mind, the kind of D&D that I have to capture is the very sort of Lake Geneva War Games Club. Like you're more focused on the logistical and strategic element of dungeon delving rather than getting together to collaborate to tell a story, which is fine. You know, I enjoy that sometimes myself, but I don't know if that made sense.
That
But
made
yeah.
total sense. That's like my
Yeah.
background too, is right from war games and BattleTech, and then of course I was playing D&D long before BattleTech because I started D&D in like '79, and then BattleTech was big in like the late '80s, I think, right?
What introduced you to that style of D&D play?
That's a good question. I feel like I was exposed very early on to Tomb of Horrors. And I know that a lot of people have a lot of capital F feelings about that module. I certainly have my own, my own gripes with it. But I think that for me was the first thing that I got my hands on that was deliberately like, this is a challenge. Like, this is a tournament. Like, you're not expected to make it all the way to the end just by showing up. That, you know, it's a game. It's a war game. It's a board game. And I liked the threatening nature of it. I liked the strange. I feel like I was at a Gen Con seminar that Wizards put on probably 2000. I'm glad you pulled that up. I remember that somebody from Wizards was talking about what made a lot of those old adventures really iconic. Like, why do we still look back on things like Tomb of Horrors or White Plume Mountain and feel nostalgia for them and keep making conversions and remakes? Is because they had a lot of very unusual, iconic imagery, right? And this is a perfect example of, like, when you say to somebody, what do you think of when you think of the Tomb of Horrors? You think of the green devil face in the wall. You think of the archway that teleports you naked. You know, there's all kinds of these, the four-armed gargoyle. Same is true for things like Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan, where you think of like the big sort of thing on the cover. It's like the bat gargoyle, and the big dragon that rolls down the stairs. I mean, I feel like what drew me in is I loved sort of the wild and woolly nature of a lot of these sort of older style adventures, because I started playing in 2000. So, because second edition was just wrapping up when I was coming of age. Because I was born in the late 80s. So I had to sort of like discover these older modules. I was like, oh, this is fun. I like this, as compared to what I was seeing with some of the more contemporary games at the time, which did seem to push towards. This was like the second edition, the Dragonlance type stuff. I don't know if any of you remember that big sort of.
Oh, yeah.
It's all like you're just kind of playing through a Dragonlance novel rather than going through, like a pulpy dungeon crawl. Which is another thing too, is I really, really love pulp and sword and sorcery. And so for me, I really loved the sort of low fantasy, gritty, primal. I also write and teach fiction writing on the side here, and I'm actually working on a sword and sorcery class. And one of the things that you learn when you dig into the history of sword and sorcery is that the heroes and heroines are often much smaller stakes. Like, there's not a lot of save the world stories. It's a lot of like, I'm Conan and I'm looking for my next gem, or the next woman, or the next, town to move on to. And for some reason that appealed to me, and I saw more of that in the sort of deadly, gritty dungeon crawl stuff, as opposed to the more high fantasy Dragonlance type things. Like, to give you an idea, my favorite setting is Dark Sun. So yeah, I felt like that kind of wandered all over the place.
So you got up to where you were writing for Kobold Press, then writing for the Dungeon Design Essentials Storytelling Collective, and then what brought you into like the OSC Adventures, OSR Adventures, and finally ShadowDark Adventures?
It's funny because I feel like, if I could speak candidly, we're all friends here. I never really got along very well with the OSR crowd. I tried to make overtures when I first started writing, like, hey, here's, like, I did a couple things for Basic Fantasy under a different name. I've also had some stuff in this magazine, Nox Spell, which I don't think is around anymore. Like, I did a couple OSR things, and the diehards didn't really love it. And so I didn't really consider myself in that space. But you know, the aesthetic and the sensibility of the you know, basic D&D in particular, I really enjoy. And so I decided to try to pull that forward in some of these things. So you've got Lost Caves of the Worm Witch here. So this was legitimately me just going, if I wanted to write an homage to Lost Caverns of Zajkanth, what would I do, right? And same with the other one, which was the Shrine of the Jaguar Princess. That's essentially an homage to Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan. As far as ShadowDark goes, I've known Kelsey for a little bit. You know, the designer of ShadowDark. She actually interviewed me several years ago for her newsletter, and that was quite fun. She made a little ebook out of it. And admittedly, I was kind of a late comer to ShadowDark. I'm not super plugged in to the TTRPG space. Like, I barely use social media. I don't really, you know, I try to avoid the internet as much as possible. And
well, in that case, we're famous.
I feel like I feel like that's important for a writer, not to get sucked in.
oh yeah, it's just so
You
easy
waste
to
a lot
get.
of time.
Yeah, you just get sucked into the nonsense.
Yeah.
But I also feel like the less people are exposed to me, the better for their appetite. Because I don't have as many, you know, opportunities to, you know, say the stupid things that I believe in. So what happens is I heard about it when the Kickstarter was popping off, and initially I wasn't like super deeply into it because in my mind I'm like, oh, this is sort of a in the 5e universe. I'm not really a big 5e person, but when I gave it a second look and I was like, oh, this is BX basically. And I actually talked to Kelsey one-on-one, and she was like, you know, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but like ShadowDark was sort of what she would do if she was able to write BX, you know, and greenfield it. Yeah. And when I dug in, I was like, oh, wow. Like, I don't know how other people feel about it, but when I was reading it, I didn't see a ton of 5th edition. What I saw was, oh, this is more similar to like OSE or some of the other retro clones. And I really, really enjoyed it. I really love the formatting that, you know, Kelsey does for the adventures, where it's much more bullet point oriented. And that was very appealing to me. I found it much, you know, quicker to write. And I think, you know, Kelsey and I are very copacetic in what we enjoy in adventures, and she's very supportive. So, you know, you kind of go where the enthusiasm is, I guess.
Yeah, that's the thing that drew me. So I didn't know anything about ShadowDark until I'd seen Kelsey do one video when the 5e OGL thing happened. And I think she was about to release ShadowDark under the OGL, and then, oh no, I have to change everything. But the thing that drew me to ShadowDark was just the layout and the format of the writing, how concise it was, and yet full and rich with information. Because that's what I really hated about the time in Dungeons and Dragons, like around 2nd edition and such, where it was like just walls of text. You know, you get this adventure, and you look back at Against the Giants, where the G1 adventure is like 8 pages long, and is chock full of like 3 days worth of adventuring, you know.
Yeah.
And then you have these other ones that are 80 pages long, just so you can tell the players a story that they don't really care about that much. So
yeah, and it forces you to be more economical in your design. Like, one of the things that I've talked about, I did a podcast / stream earlier this year called Seance with my buddy Ryan Russell, who runs the Adventure Archive. He's also one of the co-hosts of the Weekly Scroll podcast. Shout out to Ryan. But we talked about this subject, and I feel like there's a lot of adventures that will put copious amounts of background information in a room description. So it's like the players enter the room and there's 4 statues, and then you get, you know, an entire column of the history of, you know, the whatever empire. And that's not bad, but that's not information that can really be surfaced to the players. And so what it does is, with the bullet points especially, it forces me to really dial in on what are the most interesting, relevant, and gameable features of this space. And if I do want to include some lore, some backstory, I need to really, you know, use my environmental storytelling toolkit to communicate that through interesting things like magic items or terrain or treasure, instead of essentially giving the dungeon master all this backstory that they'll enjoy reading on their own, but it's not helpful for the players at all. They'll never see it. And I think what that does is it makes the gameable information harder to find. That's something that, especially when you watch other people run adventures that you have written and you see the parts that they forget or the parts that they get incorrect. Like this is something that, I mean, I didn't really have a choice, but if I could go back and redo Mailed Fist, I actually reran it this spring, and I'm just like, man, I would do this totally differently now. But that was one of the issues with it, is that because I felt like 5e is a very verbose system, it's really easy, and I notice a lot of GMs will forget things or lose things. I mean, the encounters are kind of more complicated than they needed to be anyway. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like it's you got to think about the user experience for the GM. You know, they're running this on the fly. They can't be scanning through 50 paragraphs of text.
Yeah, I feel like it feels like they're writing for the wrong audience a lot of times. Like they're writing for someone who's reading it for enjoyment, as opposed to reading it to run it. And maybe there's a lot of people that just read it for enjoyment.
There was an era where they were in the second edition days. I think that was their primary target audience for people who were into the what some people call the lonely fun of reading about the D&D adventures that they hoped they had. Because more stuff was coming out than anyone could possibly play. So you had to target the adventures that you were releasing for people who were interested in just buying them and maybe just sitting in their chair and reading the adventure and imagining how it might go.
So we got a comment from Milwaukee Joe.
Oh, hey, Joe.
He's not unnecessarily watching right now. I don't know who's watching. Chime in if you're watching. But he put this in Twitter, and it was basically kind of along the lines of, if there's information that the DM has that the players don't have, how do you get that to them? Do you have any point? You were just kind of talking about what's the gameable, actionable stuff and putting that in the room descriptions, which is definitely, I think, a good way. Is there any other advice you have in that regard?
Sure. I should first also say hello. Joe's in my gaming group, so
awesome.
He's a ringer. I put him in there to be like, first question, why are you so smart and handsome? Good question, Joe. I appreciate you asking. So I took a look at this question. This is the one about the players failed a saving throw against a curse. I'm assuming he's talking about one of the curses in Jaguar Princess. So for some background, there's one where there's jaguar mummies, and if you kill them without burning them, they're full of tarantulas that fly out at you. And when they bite you, you get what's called Star Eater venom, because the gist of the adventure is that it was this sort of like Mesoamerican ancient culture that worshipped what they thought was a god, but it was a beholder, right? A 10-eyed oracle, rather. And if this venom bites you, you start to slowly turn into a beholder. So like your eyes fuse together and you get it. What happens is you're going to die eventually. But while you're transforming, like after like 1 hour of play, you have a central eye. You can shoot anti-magic out of it. Then all your hair falls out. You grow eye stalks and you get like, 2 eye beams that you could use. And eventually your body will fall away and your head will start flying around as a little beholder type thing. Now I'm assuming he means that was super cool, but the players made their save. So what do you do in that situation?
No one knows. Yeah.
So there's a couple things you can do if you want to stay more, I guess, like more like in the actor mindset, where you don't want to give players details that they wouldn't get without their 5 senses. Then what I've done in the past is you just describe the process starting to happen, give them an idea of what's going on, and then ask them to make the save. And if they succeed, then the effects are reversed. So I might run it as, okay, you're bit by these tarantulas, and now you can see that your eye is beginning to fuse into a single large central eye. Strands of your hair are falling out, and you're starting to see little like tadpole like stalks begin to wriggle out. Then make your saving throw. So at least, this is something that frustrates me when I watch other GMs is sometimes they will just say, make a saving throw with no context, thinking that that's going to build up the drama. And sometimes, again, very specific, like it's hard to pull off. You can do it that way. But what I often find is the players don't know what they're rolling for. They don't know what the stakes are. And they don't know how to react to the roll that's been made. And so you end up having a very anticlimactic experience. This is something I talk about in one of my courses on Storytelling Collective, which is called Moments. And one of the moments that I identify in dungeon crawling is the dramatic roll. And that's a very common thing that you see in really great dungeon adventures, that there's these moments where everybody is sitting around the table with bated breath, waiting to see the outcome of this roll, right? And the way that you do that is you have to set it up. You have to tell the players, like I do this all the time to my players. It freaks them out. Like they hate the wandering monster rolls in the best possible way in ShadowDark, because I'm like, hey, hour's up, or 3 delving rounds are up. And what I do is I have like a very frightening D6. And I'm like, all right, don't forget, if I roll a 1 on this D6, it's going to be random encounter time. And then I roll it, and just the palpable sigh of relief.
Yeah. And you gave it good advice on doing that, which I completely failed to implement. If I could do it again, I'd do it better in the Worm Witch. And even giving like a special colored die for the random check for the worm to come out.
Oh yeah, because you're running online. Yeah, it's a little bit tougher when you're running online. So I use a virtual, like it's like a little 3D D6. So at least there's some kind of thing to look at. But that'd be one way. The second way, this is what I normally do, is go into what we kind of talked about pre-stream, which is like game show host mode. Like I think of the GM as less of like a storyteller or a setter of an immersive scene, and more like a game show host who is setting the stakes. Like honestly, one of my biggest inspirations for being a GM is Gordon Ramsay and MasterChef. Because the way, like you can just watch an episode and pay attention to how they set up the challenges, and the way that even in his presentation, like pauses are a really, really important thing. We might get back to that because I think Joe also asked about delivery. But what you might do is just say, okay, you've been bitten, and now the Star Eater venom courses through your veins, and you address the Dungeoneer and say, you're going to need to make a DC 18 wisdom saving throw, or you are going to slowly transform into a beholder. You will grow a central eye, and then you will grow eye stalks, and your body will fall away, and you will be a little beholder that harasses the party. So again, you're setting the stakes. Now the players wouldn't know that, but for me, I'm not as concerned with this like actor mindset. I love to just, again, try to set the stakes, build up drama, let the players know what they're what they're rolling for, so that way when the die hits the table, you're going to get a really big reaction pretty much every time, and you don't end up losing that. The last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I'm bogarting here. I don't know if a lot of you here have played the original Dark Souls 1, and I guess Elden Ring to an extent. What I like about FromSoft is that they're not afraid to hide massive sections of the game behind secrets. And I kind of think of it the same way, where if I have a secret or something really cool in the adventure, I'm okay with the fact that the players may not encounter it, because, and this is getting a little conceptual, I apologize if it's a little confusing, but when I play games, and when my group comes to play my games, a lot of the fun is knowing that there's an objective challenge. And this might even go back to the fun of tournaments, where you know that the GM is not going to fudge the experience, so that no matter what happens, nobody is left unsatisfied, that everybody at the end of the day, they rescue the prince or get the Vorpal sword or whatever. But when the players like my games, because they know that it's a completely objective world, like I don't care if they die or not, I don't care if they find the secrets or not. And I think they would be upset, as I would be upset, if I found out that, oh, the GM fudged things, like there was a secret room, we didn't perform well enough to find it, so then the GM, she just moved it behind the scenes somewhere else. I would feel cheated in that situation. Now, of course, other GMs and other play styles, that might not be appropriate, but I think it's okay to have stuff that's cool that the players may never encounter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's like first edition design was like, here's a location, there's some secret stuff in here, you may or may not find it. If you do, you'll have a cool story to tell. And then 5th edition feels like, here's a story that you're going to go through and you will succeed at the end.
Right.
And Like we just finished running Spelljammer and basically ended in a TPK, and that felt so wrong. I mean, it's like, wait a
It did
second.
it did not feel wrong,
I feel
Tom.
good.
I applaud you to have the courage as a DM to let us go down in flames.
And I'm getting that from running ShadowDark a little bit more.
But
Going back to the old
that's
school where it's like, sorry, you guys all die.
yeah, but that's my taste. So I know that there are plenty of folks who would say that's not the way to play, and that's cool, absolutely. But
So, ShadowDark and basic D&D and the style of game that you like, Sersa, it feels like it's like you're really overcoming challenges in a world that exists using any resource you can get. And it's not you're just playing the character sheet in a story that's happening.
Right, and that
Yeah.
there's there's a lot of really great literature about what is the essence of game design, like what is it that we're really doing when we're designing games. So Solon and Zimmerman have game design fundamentals, very widely cited. There's another one off the top of my head. Ian Schreiber has a course. I think it's called Game Design Concepts. You can find all the materials online for free. But really what you're doing is you're designing a reward system. And I want to say, oh no, sorry, Jeff Warren. So Jeff Warrender, and you said this would be fun. How to make a game good and how to make a good game. It's a mouthful. He talks about these game design axioms, and one of those is that your scoring design is your game design. So the things that your system rewards mechanically, those are the behaviors that players typically will gravitate towards. So if there's things that you incentivize, things that you reward, the players will do those things. And so for me, why I like creating secrets that you may or may not find, or treasures that you may or may not claim, what you're doing is you're rewarding the players for engaging in that sort of creative, exploratory behavior. If you don't do that, if it's clear to the players that no matter what they do, as long as they're participating, they'll get, the powerful magic item and defeat the monster and this sort of thing,
right,
then you're not rewarding certain behaviors. You're rewarding other behaviors. Maybe you're rewarding, more role play focused behaviors or things like that. But that's what I'm always thinking about is what is it that our game systems are rewarding players for doing? And even with the presence of a GM, you're still going to see players sort of like flowing downhill like water, gravitate towards certain behaviors. Like, for example, I don't know, this might be a controversial take. I feel like the rules from advanced D&D to 5th edition D&D, relatively speaking, are still pretty similar, especially compared to other games out there. Like the game is fundamentally the similar chassis, right? You might move some little bit, like, oh, we added backgrounds, and okay, that's cool. And what happens is over the course of as long as I've been alive, I can Google right now and have a million memes of, oh, the players didn't follow the story, or they blew up the NPC, or they murdered people in the town, or burned down the castle. When was the last time you saw a meme where it's like, my players just really, really did a good job of role playing, and I wanted them to, you know what I mean? Like and there's a reason for that, is because the rules that we've created that have sort of endured, I think, mostly unchanged for about 50 years now, are encouraging certain behaviors. And there's a really good blog series by Ludite Sam. I think it was called Chasing the Dragon. It was like a 5-part series, and it had a really, really great entry in it talking about how, it's difficult to just put the veneer of role play on top of something like D&D. Like, you can add backgrounds, but the game is, you open the rule book and it's full of say die effects. It's full of strange random magic items that will kill you if you touch them. And there's so many things. Like, the rules are all about being hurting others while avoiding being hurt yourself. But then we try to pretend that it's actually community theater. And it's like, you got to really kind of pick, and that might be a hot take. I don't really love getting into edition chat, but I don't know. I guess to answer your question, I like those styles because it does seem like the way that the games and the adventures are designed, it encourages the kind of gameplay that I enjoy the most.
Yeah, I saw an article, I forget who it was, or it might have been a video, about how first edition rewarded XPs for gold, and that drove how the players played. They sought out the gold.
Oh,
And
100%.
yeah, and they avoided fights that they didn't have to fight. And then I forget which edition it was where all the XP were from monsters, so now all the characters just wanted to fight monsters. They didn't care about the gold so much.
Yeah, and
And now it's merging over to milestones, so now you just kind of sit there, and as long as you're there, you get XP.
yeah, and
When
you
we
and,
did the open, and all you got rewarded for completing encounters, which was crossing the map, and you would just run as fast as you
Oh
could
yeah,
across the map.
yeah. There's many open encounters that were just basically that. It's like get to that room, get to that door, get out of here, as opposed to,
Yeah.
other things. So yeah, it really
yeah,
is true that the reward system engenders the play.
it's interesting because you'll see this in other game design industries. It's pretty well understood, and a great example of just what you talked about. I'm a big roguelike player. I also develop roguelikes, and my favorite one is a game called Brogue, which is a sort of a modern reimagining of the original mainframe Rogue from the 80s. And one of the things that Brian Walker, the developer of the game, did was take away XP from monsters. So in most roguelikes, you level up by killing monsters, and you need those levels to survive the later depths of the dungeon. And what he did was he removed that. So the only way that you can level up is through finding certain kinds of treasure, so like potions of life, potions of strength. And what he observed, and why the game is extremely popular, is it opened up a whole world of play possibilities that you really couldn't get. So it's like, all right, now I can really have a viable build where I'm not very strong in combat, but I'm constantly teleporting away, or using stealth abilities, or using terrain effects. Like in that game, you can throw, like a potion of incineration on some dry grass and burn a bridge away. And a lot of people really, really loved that because they felt like if they had to engage with monsters, then the combat-oriented treasure was always the best treasure to pick, and the combat-oriented aggressive play style was always the best to play. And so once you decoupled advancement in the game from that specific behavior, you kind of made the reward structure, because now you can get to the treasure in different ways. You can fight if you want to, if that's your build, or you can be kind of sneaky, or you can use all different sorts of strategies to get that treasure to level up, and then ultimately get the Amulet of Yendor. And a lot of people, including myself, really enjoy that. And I actually carry that forward in my own roguelikes, where you find the gold and the treasure. That's how you level up. So,
And some of the indie stuff like Blades in the Dark or the other Forged in the Dark games, you gain experience for trying things that are at the edge of your abilities. So you make a desperate check to do something, and that's when you have the opportunity to earn experience. And so it pushes you towards more desperate action, more cinematic, pulpy sorts of things rather than safe choices.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think even games like Dungeon World, you get experience points through failing skill checks, which is really interesting. But yeah, I feel like that's something that I think a lot of people, if they're newer to D&D, may not understand about, like the gold is XP system. I think there was even some thread that I caught today about it where they tried to superimpose that rule, but on like 5th edition, and they really, really did not have a good time. And it's like, well, because things like OD&D in particular, they were built around that assumption that you would be doing kind of weird things to bypass monsters. Like you're not going up and fighting the Medusa. You're trying to maybe, use ventriloquism to have a little voice, and then you run past her when she's distracted. And if you don't have a supporting infrastructure around that kind of mechanic, that it's, treasure and gold that levels you up, then it gets very frustrating because you're playing 5th edition and almost all the rules are about combat or spell casting. And you really struggle to feel like it's fair. I don't know if I articulated that well.
Yeah.
So we ran recently Tomb of the Dust Queen, and that went really well. I forgot the party had a certain magic item that made the end a little anticlimactic, but it's, these adventures that you're writing, the other thing I like about them is what you talked about, is how you're trying to get to the treasure or get to the end, and using everything that's available in the environment to get there. And I read these adventures and I think, oh, this is too much. They're going to die for sure. And the players pull through. It's really, it's fun to watch as a DM. So it's a different experience as a DM too, because you DM these, 5th edition storyline adventures like, I know how it's going to end. And when you DM adventures like these, you're like, well, I think they're going to die, but let's find out. So it's a lot more fun as a DM.
Yeah, it creates a lot of really exciting uncertainty, which I think is really important for a DM to have fun, to not know how everything's going to play out. And actually, speaking of not Tomb of the Dust Queen, but Worm Witch, Joe, who was leaving some questions earlier, he's run it once. I've run it twice now. And all 3 times the players approached that first section completely differently. So Joe's group managed to actually convince all of the desert raiders to band together and fight the man scorpion and the woman scorpion. Like, they just led, I don't know how they used like a spell or did something really cool, but they managed to convince this army of like 3 dozen bandits to come fight them. My group took a similar but more gruesome tack where they used Turn Undead and they funneled this giant man scorpion skeleton into that room and then cast like Hold Portal and essentially waited until the screaming stopped.
Oh God. Yeah, I mean, I love the ways players can do these things, and they can't just go fight it. They can't go fight 40 bandits.
Yeah,
that's not going to end well. So they have to come up with real creative ways of getting through there.
Yeah, and I think, I don't mean to pick on certain people, but you'll see that even in the ShadowDark Discord, I had someone leave a very well-meaning comment. This adventure, like, the monsters seem too deadly, and it seemed too deadly. And I think that, when you play through it, you find that if anything, it's not dialed up enough. I feel like people are not dying enough in Worm Witch.
So we're playing it, so no spoilers for the end of it, because David's playing in it right now. But we're through the first 2 areas and into the third, the main dungeon.
Yeah.
And we're about halfway through the main dungeon. And they've taken on some opponents, that I thought, oh, God, this is going to be horrendous. And they've done really good. Now they're coming to the really, really tough ones the next time we play. So we'll see if they make it the rest of the way. But it's fun to watch them come up with ingenious ways. And, there's lots of seeded treasure in there that can be used. And the thing I like also about ShadowDark and your adventures and Kelsey's adventures is you better use every magic item you ever find, or else you're not going to live. And whereas 5th edition, it's like, oh, keep all the magic so we have it when we get to the end. We're not going to die because this is a story that we have to succeed at. So
that's right.
The team's not going to kill us. So,
yeah, and pretty much every treasure is placed to be used against certain enemies. Yeah, like it's meant to be to set you up to use those things if you're smart. But back to that earlier thing I was saying about the person who, if I had to speculate, was probably more of a 5e side of the house coming to ShadowDark than OSR.
It might have been me. It sounds like something I wrote.
No, I think it was no, I would have recognized it was you.
I wrote oh my God, they're all going to die. But I'm going to have fun at least.
Yeah, this was in the private Discord chat. But but I think when you come at it, you look at it, and if you're not familiar with sort of this play style of, you're not sort of lining up and then going toe to toe with the monster in a straight up like trading blows fight, but rather the players, one, don't have to fight all the monsters, that they can just do kind of a Quake rocket jump, onto the next area, or they've got items or creative use of spells, or even like interesting kind of role playing. Like, hey, those 40 bandits, you don't have to fight them. You can get them on your side and bring a whole little army with you. And I think that's not apparent to a lot of people who will just look at the stat block for a monster and see poison DC 12 save or die, and they're just like, whoa, that's a little much, don't you think? And it's like, no, in fact, it should be DC 21. Honestly, I should just go back and change the PDF.
Ouch.
Yeah, when players hear save or die, that's a moment. They're like, oh, okay, this is serious now.
Yeah, but when you get into that mindset, I wanted to say something about the TPK thing. I'm wrapping up playtesting for my new ShadowDark adventure, and in the last playtest, I TPK'd the party. And at the end of it, I was like, I do like a plus delta with them. Like, hey, what did you like? And do you have any recommendations? And they're like, no notes. Like, no, that was cool. Like when you get into that mindset, the TPK is not something to be like mourned over. They were just like, hell yeah. I was like, driving a stolen car and crashing into the median, and you get out and you're like, that was cool.
Yeah.
So on the moments stuff and that, especially that the storytelling collective stuff that you've got there. One of the things that I think is we see a lot of trainings like some of the other courses and some of the other stuff you've talked about where we're really speaking to game designers and adventure writers and stuff like that. But especially this moments idea thing feels to me like something that would be really valuable just for DMs who are running other people's stuff, because that, unlike a lot of this advice and a lot of this training, is really about the moments that you create at the table and how to stage that stuff, and not just how to write something that can be presented or will feed this sort of storytelling. Am I right about, or am I on the right track with that? Is that something that you're seeing in the folks who've run through the course?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. Because one of the things with moments in particular, so for those who might not be familiar, this is my online course called Dungeon Design Essentials Moments, and it sort of grew out of this work that I was doing where, and I was reading a lot of game design theory and seeing how other industries and other game designers do things. And this term that you'll see come up again and again and again in game design literature is that game design is a second order design problem. And so what that means is that we don't, as game designers, we can't directly design a player's experience. I can't take like this idea of cool Indiana Jones and then inject it into somebody's brain, like, you know, Clockwork Orange style. Like, well, all you can do as a game designer is create rules, create systems that will encourage the kind of play experience that you want to create. There's this framework that game designers use called MDA, which I'd have to actually, let me just go over really quick. It's been a minute since I should know it off the top of my head. I always get it confused with a different acronym. Yeah, so it's mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, right? And so what you're doing is you're creating these aesthetics. I'm sorry to get a little academic here, but basically they say there's different kind of goals that you might have as a game designer. So they talk about things like sensation, so game as sense pleasure, so you're enjoying audiovisual effects. Games as make-believe, games as drama. The one that I think is really relevant to us is game as obstacle course, right? So if you're designing a game primarily to be a sort of obstacle course type experience, the mechanics that you will design for that game will differ from a game that is more focused on what they call the narrative aesthetic or drama or expression, game as self-discovery, what's sometimes called like the paper doll aspect of games, where I can decorate my character and pick her clothes and sort of enjoy living that fantasy. But anyway, so I was thinking about, okay, we have this very well-developed framework for doing this in traditional games and video games, but I didn't really see anything like this in tabletop RPGs. And in fact, what you often find is that RPGs are sort of unique in that there's a lot of people that reject the idea that mechanics have anything to do at all with the play experience. That they say, well, you know, you can play it any way you want, and it's just up to the GM and the players. And, you know, I don't personally believe that. It's not been my experience, and I just don't think it makes sense from a theoretical perspective. But anyway, what I did was, okay, if we're designing a play experience, and a play experience is basically just a series of moments, individual moments of play, what are those moments? And I sat down, okay, why do I like Death Trap Dungeon and old school type dungeons? Why do my friends come back to my, you know, table? Some of them I've been playing with for, you know, over a decade. I mean, Joe's one of my oldest players. I think I've been playing with him for, I don't know, 10 plus years now, since the beginning of the fourth core days, at least. And I came up with this list of like different moments. So one of them was like the dramatic roll. There's the hard choice. There's the rescue, the narrow escape. And then from there, I sort of created this framework. Because like when you're designing something, whether it's a monster, a trap, you know, a magic item, you design it through the lens of these moments. So you ask yourself, okay, like I have a little mini in front of me here, a little Death Knight looking guy. He's got a shield and a flail. If I want to design this monster, it's not enough to just go, okay, he has a flail, 1d8 damage, and also he's undead, so he's immune to non-magical attacks, and you call it a day. Okay, so what moments is this monster I'm designing going to try to encourage? So if it's a dramatic roll, okay, then I need to introduce something into this monster where it's going to create a situation where I'm going to make one of those really frightening rolls that all the players stop and hold their breath. And if one of the other ones is like hard choice, then I need to design something for this monster, a power or a trait or whatever, that is going to put one or more players in a position to make a difficult trade-off, right? And the hope is that by doing that, by inflecting everything that you're designing through the lens of these moments, you're essentially you're driving directly at the kind of play experience you want to create, rather than, hoping that a fun play experience happens to emerge out of, I don't know what you want to describe, like some random, like, oh, I just have a monster here and a treasure item here, and hopefully it creates fun, I don't know if that makes sense. I kind of rambled there. I'm sorry.
No,
I feel like that kind of ties in with I was looking at your guide to Death Trap dungeon design, and it seems like a lot of those instances that are listed in there are kind of designed to make moments or dilemmas. Is there a relationship between the two? Or
so if I'm correct, you're talking about the Fortune Teller's Guide?
That could be. I just wrote down Guide to Death Trap Dungeon Design. That might be the Fortune Teller's Guide.
It's the one that had all the Deck of Many Things cards in it.
Exactly. That's
yeah.
Right.
So I actually wrote that in 2015. So I think that was sort of a very early exploration of those ideas. So that was actually before I even started reading a lot of this game design theory stuff. But I think you're right. Like, it was an attempt to distill down the experience of a good traditional dungeon crawl, and then put it into a format where a designer or even a dungeon master, a game master, could look at this and go, okay, this is the experience I want to create. So if I want to create this dramatic role, here are some very explicit bullet points for how I do that. Like in this course, you'll see there's a whole lesson in here that's just a copious amounts of bullet points about, if I'm designing a trap, and I have a rescue moment or a narrow escape moment, how can I design that trap to get there? And I think the Fortune Teller's Guide was a very early step into the dark on that one. Because my thing is, I talk about this with Ashley a lot for Storytelling Collective, is we're trying to help creatives be more mindful. I think that's something that a lot of people, especially new designers, struggle with, is that they maybe have a vague intuition of what they want to do, but they're not really designing mindfully. You'll even see this, like, if you do collaborative design streams. Like, I'll pop into those every once in a while. My friend will do those. It's like, hey, let's design a monster together, or design a dungeon room together. And what you'll see is a lot of people throwing ideas out because they just seem kind of cool. Mm-hmm. But there's not really any sort of mindfulness around, like, what are we trying to accomplish with this specific element? And what is it about the play experience that we want to plug this element into? And then how do we specifically design for those moments? Instead, it's just like, well, a pit trap seems cool. And I like iguanas, so we can put iguanas in there. As opposed to doing a more mindful approach. Like, the last thing I'll say about this is, in my day job, I work in user experience and design systems and that sort of thing. And you would be looked at as a psycho if you just decided to freestyle it and say, I'm just going to build this interface. I'm just going to do whatever I feel like and just go with my gut. Like, there's a very, well-developed set of practices and approaches and frameworks to creating the experience you want. So it's like, hey, I need to get students to enroll for this summer program. You're going to then design something that is very, very explicitly tuned to create that experience. You don't just sort of pick buttons and colors and fonts and because you think that they're aesthetically pleasing. You're going to evaluate them through the lens of, like, okay, does this convert well? Is this creating the experience? Is this creating what we want, which is students coming in and being excited by the prospect of the summer program and then ultimately applying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned you were doing another adventure for ShadowDark. Any hints on what that's going to be?
I have 4 adventures in the
4 more.
Yeah, in the hopper.
Nice.
So yeah, the one that I was playtesting is called Caldera of the Sickle Dancer, where you venture into a volcano layer of a dancing girl turned Merilith. There was an eruption and people thought that she was gone, but centuries later it turns out she's back, and so the players are going in there to muck around, and there's some pretty wild stuff. Chapel of Grief, which is one that I've shared on Twitter, that's more on my dark fantasy side of things. And then there's one coming up I'm just calling like the Atlantean Sword, which is a first level one because it seems like there's a real desire for first level ShadowDark modules to introduce people. And then who knows, some other thing that I've got like just notes strewn about for.
And then you were also working on like some game or rules content. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah,
the fortune teller just dropped, it looks like.
Yeah, so I designed a class for the fortune teller. I typically don't create player focused content. I don't enjoy it as much, and I find it kind of difficult. So this probably won't be a habit. The fortune teller is sort of like me designing the class that I would want to play. And you'll see that it has a lot of the same thought process behind designing it that I use for things like dungeon adventure. So I sat down, I was like, okay, what sort of moments should this class be able to participate in? And, you know, if I'm picturing this character in the dungeon, what are the moments that she is going to shine? Because again, I think people get into this mindset where it's like, oh, she's a fortune teller, or so I'll just give her like a, you know, advantage to certain skills. I might give her like a once a day reroll. Like you get a lot of very conservative design, right? A lot of just like, I'm playing it safe. I'm not really thinking about what is it that this character is going to do in the dungeon. How is she useful? And what are those moments where she's really going to shine? So for me, you know, I love playing support characters, and I love coming in like in the clutch. Like I love being able to say like to someone who's about to die, like, no, check this out. Reroll that crit against my friend. I love doing that kind of stuff. I love exploration and puzzles. And so she has the ability to channel the spirits of the dead to get hints about what's going on. And then that sort of coalesced into this fortune teller class. I love unusual gimmicks. You know, I feel like we see a lot of stuff where it's just you read it and you're like, okay, like there's no real excitement there to want to play it. But with this, you actually use an actual tarot deck and you draw from it to use some of your powers. And even if you're not really a big like support character or exploration character player, you're just like, oh, like this seems cool. Like it would be fun. Like my friend Erin play tested it and helped design it. And she just had a blast. She's like, this is so cool. Like immediately when she saw it, she's like, yes, I'm getting my cat themed tarot deck and I'm going to sit down with it. I have another one that I'm kind of playing with called the Princess, and it's inspired by all of the like wayfish princess characters that always accompany Conan. So like in every Conan story, there's always some like, you know, underdressed like princess of a lost kingdom who wants to leave the castle walls and go adventure. And so that's sort of like Yasmela and Black Colossus. And so that's another class I'm kind of playing with. But again, it's always like, okay, what are the moments that this character is going to shine in? Mm-hmm. Rather than just being like, well, she's a princess, so she has advantage on like checks revolving royalty, or like she's got a handmaiden and servant system where it allows her to sort of twist. So like one of the things, like once per day, there's like this chart that she can use. And one of the abilities is that, you know, the idea behind the handmaidens and the servants is that even though she fled the castle and is sort of abandoning her duties as a royal daughter, there are still those loyal to her throughout the realm that can do things for her. So one of her abilities is like on this chart of handmaids and servants that she can use once a day is false accusation, because you know the magistrate in this town in the kingdom, you can falsely accuse somebody and that NPC of your choice is jailed for 24 hours. You know what I mean? Or you've got some other stuff like you can spread rumors, or just, you know, what would it be? What's something a little bit different than just advantage on persuasion? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a fortune teller in Wild Beyond the Witchlight, not this fortune teller class, but a character playing a fortune teller. And that really plays into the DM working with the player too. They can do a lot of that. Like I kind of too late into the campaign clued into that, but I would get with that player before the adventure and basically feed her what kind of fortunes she would, you know, be able to tell. And some of them would be true and some would not be true, but they tie to the adventure directly. And so that's
awesome.
Then players would be like, holy shit, how did you know that was going to happen? You know, I mean, of course they figured it out pretty quick. I'm sure
Yeah.
that I was telling her. But
I didn't figure it out.
Dave never figured it out.
I
But
think
yeah,
that's
that's another fun thing to do. with regard to fortune teller type classes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just about, I know we want to move on from this, but it's whether it's dungeon design or class design or magic items, this is something that I really try to do is just what's something that someone hasn't seen before.
Yeah.
And not in like I don't consider myself to be like some kind of visionary brain genius, but I just think like, okay, if I'm designing like, let's say a pit trap, like does the world really need another 10-foot pit trap with spikes? Like it's, it's the 90s. Come on. Like let's try to do something a little unusual. Cause what I want to do is when GMs open up, and hopefully that's something that those of you have felt here, is that you read through it and you're just like, oh, I didn't expect to see that, or that's kind of a really weird, unusual, like I'll spoil a trap from, if you don't mind, Tom, one of the traps that they didn't trigger in Wormwitch.
Okay.
It was from the room that had the amber force field in front of it.
Right.
And they went in, they got the chime.
Right.
Now the little statuette was on a weight sensitive plate. So if they didn't do the little Indiana Jones switcheroo, they were kind of smart because you activated it while it was still on the plinth. But what happens is if you mess with it, all of this scorpion dust billows into the room and it settles in the lungs of the character that was in there with the talisman, and their voice changes and they become kind of hoarse. And what the GM is instructed to do is to ask the player to name a violent verb that begins with the letter S. So the example that's given is skewer, right?
Yeah.
So then unknown to the players, the next time they encounter a scorpion type or like an insect type monster, so like the man scorpion, the woman scorpion, or the purple worm, the dust inside you as it agitates, and as if you were being controlled by some other force, you fall to your knees and you shout, "Oh, great scorpion of Kemet, verb us." So like, "Oh, great scorpion of Kemet, skewer us." And that creature would get a new power thematic to the verb you picked. So the example was, okay, if they picked skewer, then it gets an elongated stinger that does like double poison or can skewer 2 enemies at once. But again, like, people would read that and they're just like, oh, that's kind of wild, because you expect to see they inhale the dust, they make a DC 15 con save or take 2d6 points of ability damage. And it's like, no, you've got to just take it one step further. You don't have to do it with everything, but just have something in there that makes the DM excited to play it and makes the players be like, wow, I didn't expect that,
Yeah. Yeah. I was looking forward to that one. And then they said, no, we'll just take the chime and walk outside and then we'll ring the chime. Like, God damn it.
Yeah. Now, one thing I do with home games, like if I know I'm playing with like that group again, I'll just pocket that and then work it into the next dungeon and say, well, maybe they'll get them this time. Yep. So.
Yeah, this dungeon, I mean, it just is a lot of fun. And, you have the room where there's the whole, there's giants, there's a huge number of bandits. There's no way to assault that room. So it just makes for creative thinking, and it's fun to watch as the DM. A lot of fun to watch. So, anyone else have any questions for Sersa?
One of the things that that stands out looking at your work is that you kind of rely on a random element with the cards, for example, in some of your adventures where they've got cards for rumors and treasure and so on. And then your Fortune Teller's Guide to Death Trap Dungeon Design, it's got the idea that you're going to randomize your creative process, something that I really like. Do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between a random element like that and your creative works?
That's a really great question. I appreciate you asking that. So I'm a really big believer in procedural, like really lo-fi procedural generation to come up with ideas. And this may or may not surprise folks, but both Wormwitch, Jaguar Princess, and Tomb of the Dust Queen were all procedurally generated to a substantial degree. Now, when I say that, I don't mean it was like a ChatGPT thing where it wrote the modules for me, but rather, I mean, I have across my desk here tons and tons of charts, of roll tables, of cards. Like I use tarot a lot. I have this little system. And essentially what happens is I come into a when I come to a room in a dungeon, I then generate a number of different aspects of it. So like, what is the primary challenge here? What is the primary moment that I want to achieve with this room? What's the terrain in this room? So I'll roll like on a terrain table. There's a couple other ones. So like in the traps course, for example, there's a number of roll tables for trap type, trap effect, the moment that it produces. So actually, like, we can roll on it right now if you want.
Yeah,
Let's do it.
Yeah, let me pull it up here. I got I don't have it that I can share because it is a paid product. So buy the course. But let's see here. I can kind of take you through an example of kind of what that process is like for me. So let me go here. I've got a million files. So traps. So the first thing I usually roll. So I don't know if anybody has dice on them. Can you give me a D4 and a D6? Let's have some fun.
Yeah, let's do it.
Go for it.
I'll do the D6 is a 4. Anyone got a D4 going? I'll do that too if you don't have it.
Got it.
Go
3.
ahead, John. 3 on the D4, 4 on the D6.
So this trap type is Magic Mouth. So let's say I was using, like, I like to use the AD&D DMG a lot, which I regret giving away my physical copy. I had one as a teenager. And I was like, oh, I don't really need this. And now it's $300.
Fun story. Last night we were playing, or 2 nights ago we were playing, and the party finds a potion of treasure finding, and I'm like, that's not in ShadowDark. Let me go get my first edition DMG. Okay, its area is 24 inches, and
Oh, hell yeah.
it was fun.
How many segments does that cost? So yes, we have a Magic Mouth. So that's like, this would be my price if I rolled like there's a trap in this room on like the AD&D DMG. So then I would move on over to, okay, it's a Magic Mouth. Now I'm going to roll on the visibility thing. So someone give me a D6. Yeah,
D6.
I miss that book so much.
I know.
Yeah.
3 on the D6.
So we have a Magic Mouth where the trigger of this trap is invisible, but the hazardous effect is visible, right? So it's not clear to the players immediately what triggers the Magic Mouth, but they can see evidence of the trap's effect here. So it could be like physical residue. It could be something in the air, like they feel ozone or magic. But essentially this, they know that something bad happened here. They just don't know how it happened. So then let's give me another D6 for location and timing.
1.
So this is same area, immediate effect. So this is whole table here of like essentially which area does it affect, and then what kind of effect is it? Is it immediate? Is it like a one and done thing? Is it a delayed effect where they trigger it and then there's sort of like a count up or a count down until something happens? Or is it an ongoing effect like, hey, it's spitting out gas and the gas continues to billow every turn? So you have a Magic Mouth. The players don't know when they enter the room what sets it off, but they can see the effects of its hazard, and then its effect will affect the same area, immediate effect. Let's go on over to the effects table. So give me a D4 and a D6.
D4 is a 1. D6 is a 4.
So that will be... Where is it at? What were those again?
1 on the 4 and 4 on the 6.
So this is make a previously safe area unsafe. So this is one of 24 different trap effects that are in the course. So we have a Magic Mouth. The trigger's not visible, but the hazard is, and the effect of this hazard when triggered happens immediately, and it's going to make a previously safe area in the dungeon unsafe. Now, this is where sort of the creativity comes in. That's why I said, it's not like ChatGPT is writing it. And this is what's fun for me is I'm essentially getting this random blender of different sort of aspects of this trap expressed in a very generic way. It becomes my responsibility as a designer to bring all these different things together. And oftentimes you get combinations that, you're like, what am I going to do with this? And that's where the really good stuff happens.
Yeah.
And then the last table is the moments table. So let's go ahead and get a D4 and a D6 on that.
D4 is a 2 and D6 is a 5.
So that's going to be closed loop. So closed loop is basically like you see in a lot of video games where you can see something you want to get to, but you can't quite get to it. Maybe there's a magic item on the other side of a portcullis. And then later on, the players find a way to get over to it. And they're like, oh, this is the thing that we were looking for. So these are the different elements we have in our little blender. And then as a designer, I stand at my whiteboard until 2 a.m. and I go, how in the hell am I gonna make these come together? And then you add on some other flavor. So of course the dungeon has a theme. So you want to inflect it through the theme. So if it's like Egypt, pyramid, you would kind of use those elements. Like, okay, maybe the magic mouth is in like a sphinx face or a pharaoh face, or it's a mummy. But does that kind of like, that's kind of in a nutshell my process for designing modules for the most part. And like all 3 of the ShadowDark modules were created using this process with some experimentation here and there.
And when you're like running it for the first time, playtesting it for the first time, do you like kind of let the party inform it some of the time too, and kind of leave it free form until you run it?
Yeah, I definitely am a big fan of play testing it and then bringing in interesting ideas the players have, or kind of seeing where they gravitate towards. So if there's certain elements that I don't feel like were as fleshed out, but the players seem to latch onto it, I might go back and embellish them a bit more, make them have more of a prominent role. But yeah, definitely kind of giving it a test run and seeing how players react. And that's something I say in the course, is that ultimately, like, the stuff that I teach and the stuff that I use for my own design, it's helpful, but there's no such thing as a perfect module. And there's no such, like, you're never going to get it right. Like, every single module, like, I look at Mailed Fist, even though it's only like 5 years old, I'm just like, no. Like, what was I doing? I think I was on a lot of energy drinks at the time.
That must be selling well, though. It says out of stock.
Again?
Out of stock, yep. We played that at the first DaveCon, right, David?
That's correct. I ran that adventure, and I relished the amount of threat that was piled into it, the amount of flavor that was in it.
Yeah, as players, we love that too.
Yeah.
John got his eyes gouged out very early on, so that was...
Not my character, though. Got better.
But on the other hand, you're right. It is I felt like I was on the brink of handling as much as I could with my DM bandwidth, and I probably have less DM bandwidth than most folks, but there was a lot of balls in the air to keep going through that adventure.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree. Like, even just rerunning it a couple years down the road, some of that was, I think, the verbosity of games like 5th edition, but at the same time, it's like, I didn't have a lot of these ideas fully formed. Like, I didn't have moments. So for me, I was kind of doing what I was talking about earlier, which is throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and seeing what's stuck. And in my mind, I sort of confused complexity, like having a lot of things going on, than, maybe having fewer elements, but more tightly designed. You know what I mean? Like, getting more mileage out of fewer elements than being like, well, there's going to be this monster and this monster and this trap, and it's going to, I have this idea of trying to recreate the experience of playing Doom Eternal, but at the tabletop. But it doesn't really work out super well. So yeah, I 100% agree. Like, that's been an issue, I think, in a lot of my holders. And I might look back in a couple years on the ShadowDark stuff, and I'll notice things that I didn't really, deliver on the way I wanted to. And maybe for people who are listening, who are, they want to be designers or just want to be better DMs, like, it's never going to be perfect. Just take that pressure off yourself. Just do the best you can and try to keep learning and improving, and it'll work out. And don't be afraid to go back and just say, hey, I didn't really do that as well as I wanted to, or I didn't know what I know now. And just have that humility, because I would never, even though I teach classes, I would never say that I'm like, I know I'm the end all be all. Like, I guarantee you there's kind of like there's this author, Dean Wesley Smith, who I follow and take a lot of his workshops. He talks about this idea of levels. Like, he talks about fiction, but I think the same is true in adventure design, that you go into this big building and that's writing, that's designing. And it's got all these floors and levels like a super mall. And every time you go up one, you think you're at the top, and you realize there's 100 more stories above you. And that's what it feels like. No matter how far along you get, there's always going to be more to learn. And you're just to have fun enjoying the process, because you're never going to know everything. And as soon as you think you know everything, that's when you're dead as a creative.
Mm-hmm. So, and don't be afraid to start. I think a lot of people might be afraid to start. I started when I was 9 years old. Can't imagine how horrible those games might have been if I was an adult and sat down at one of them. But we had a great time. We didn't know how hit points worked. We didn't know how to roll hit points for our characters. We didn't know what hit dice were. But we just loved the game. So just start playing. It's so much fun.
And if I could borrow another sort of phrase in the fiction writing world, Nina Kariki Hoffman, like a really big fantasy fiction writer, has this phrase, dare to be bad. I think that's hers. That's advice they give to new writers, where it's like, dare to be bad. It takes more courage to put something on the page that's imperfect and not have people not like it than it is to say, you know what, I'm just not going to write at all. Like, people said incredibly nasty things about me when I put my 4th edition stuff out there. I took it more personally then because I was 21 years old, but now I'm just like, I don't give a shit. I'm going to put stuff out there. Some folks are going to like it, some aren't, and I just don't care. Like, I don't read reviews of my own work. I usually don't even watch like streams or actual plays. I am catching up on yours.
Oh, thanks.
But that's the thing, is you just got to enjoy the process and have fun and dig into your creativity and not worry about, like, is somebody in N world going to, call me a dork.
I think way too many people make a sport of trying to be the one who dunked the best on someone. And it's really unfortunate. So just ignore that.
Yeah.
So had one more comment from Milwaukee Joe to take us out maybe. How do you come up with themes? So you have some really great themes. Where do you get them from?
That's a good question. Kind of back to this idea of procedural generation and combinations. Typically, when I come up with a theme for an adventure, I have 2 what I call theme keywords, 2 little like theme elements. And what I like to do is dig into my aesthetic taste, my taste in media influences, particularly things that have nothing to do with tabletop gaming or games in general. And then you can find a lot of really interesting new ideas by squishing 2 things together that might not have gone together. So for example, I'm kind of sketching out an idea for another ShadowDark adventure. And I'm like, okay, what are some interesting influences that are in my life right now? Because, you want to be original, but people think being original is like having receiving some revelation from God. That's like, I have been given an insight into something no one's done before. And for me, it's like every individual is a unique blend of influences and tastes. And if you just lean into those and blend them together, you come up with something very, very unique. Like, one of the nicest things I think anybody ever said about my writing was one of the Kobold Press people that was like, it's very distinctive, right? Like, if you pick it up, you're like, oh, this is clearly a Sersa Victory module. You know what I mean? And I love that. I'm like, yes, that's what I want to accomplish. So like for this new one, I got a 100-year-old book recently about the lost continent of Lemuria. It's like this, the
Nice.
weird sunken continent that apparently all human beings came from, and it sank into the ocean 50 years ago or 50,000 years ago. That would have been pretty recent. At the same time, I also found there's like a new age store in my city. And so I popped in there and I got a book about, like, if you're a teenage girl and you want to make your own shadow grimoire, here's how you do it. So it's like, what if I smush those together? So what if I have these 2 different ideas of like the sunken continent of Lemuria, and then like instruction guides for teen girls to create their own books to the goddess Morrigan. And then, what do you come up with? And I often find that you get, very flavorful, interesting themes rather than, I love the classics. I'll never say no to like going to Undermountain and punch an orc, but like, it's sometimes people want something a little bit different. Yeah, let's see here. We got apparently it filled up. Oh, it's so tiny on this map. According to this book, which is very authoritative because it's in hardback, it filled up the entire Pacific Ocean. Like,
oh wow,
yeah.
This is from Gary Gygax's Dangerous Journeys game. So that's he threw
awesome.
Murray in there too.
Yeah, apparently they were all psychic. That's the thing. I guess they lived, even though they were constantly menaced by dinosaurs and bugs in the heat. And according to this author, like, never left their huts. They somehow managed to endure for 500,000 years as a civilization, and they were all psychic. So I'm like, cool. Yeah, let's do it.
Nice. All right. Any last questions, David or John?
I just want to see, are you thinking about a book about the moment stuff? I think that's different enough and interesting enough and useful enough.
Yeah.
That you ought to be thinking about it.
There is some stuff in the works that I'm not able to talk about at the moment. But it's in that universe. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
Looking forward to all of whatever that might be, this mysterious stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot going on.
Good.
David, anything else?
All set.
All right. Well, Sersa, thank you very much for being on the show. And we're looking forward, obviously, to more of the stuff that you work on and put out there.
Well, thank you for having me.
For 10 years.
Well, I really appreciate that. It's I can imagine a lot of creators feel this way, where it's very lonely. Like you don't really interact a whole lot, especially since it's mostly online. I don't really get a sense of people playing. It's also because I'm a Luddite and I'm like, I will never use a computer. That's how they get you. But it's just nice to hear that people are enjoying it, because you don't get that immediate direct feedback. So yeah, I'm very grateful that you had me on tonight.
All right. Good night, everyone.